Section 29 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel, Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place Names the Place, Part 10. It was promptly settled between us that he and I were to be great friends forever. And he would say our friendship as though he were speaking of some important and delightful thing which had an existence independent of ourselves, and which he soon called, not counting his love for his mistress, the great joy of his life. These words made me rather uncomfortable, and I was at a loss for an answer, for I did not feel when I was with him and talked to him, and no doubt it would have been the same with everyone else, any of that happiness which it was, on the other hand, possible for me to experience when I was by myself. For alone, at times, I felt surging from the depths of my being one or other of those impressions which gave me a delicious sense of comfort. But as soon as I was with someone else, when I began to talk to a friend, my mind at once turned about. It was towards the listener and not myself that it directed its thoughts, and when they followed this outward course, they brought me no pleasure. Once I had left Saint Loup, I managed, with the help of words, to put more or less in order the confused minutes that I had spent with him. I told myself that I had a good friend, that a good friend was a rare thing, and I tasted, when I felt myself surrounded by goods that were difficult to acquire, what was precisely the opposite of the pleasure that was natural to me, the opposite of the pleasure of having extracted from myself and brought to light something that was hidden in my inner darkness. If I had spent 2 or 3 hours in conversation with Saint Loup, and he had expressed his admiration of what I had said to him, I felt a sort of remorse, or regret, or weariness at not having been left alone and ready at last to begin my work. But I told myself that one is not given intelligence for one's own benefit only, that the greatest of men have longed for appreciation, that I could not regard as wasted hours in which I had built up an exalted idea of myself in the mind of my friend. I had no difficulty in persuading myself that I ought to be happy in consequence, and I hoped all the more anxiously that this happiness might never be taken from me simply because I had not yet been conscious of it. We fear more than the loss of everything else the disappearance of the goods that have remained beyond our reach, because our heart has not taken possession of them. I felt that I was capable of exemplifying the virtues of friendship better than most people, because I should always place the good of my friends before those personal interests to which other people were devoted, but which did not count for me. But not of finding happiness in a feeling which, instead of multiplying the differences that there were between my nature and those of other people, as there are among all of us, would cancel them. At the same time, my mind was distinguishing in Saint Loup a personality more collective than his own, that of the noble, which, like an indwelling spirit, moved his limbs, ordered his gestures and his actions. Then, at such moments, although in his company, I was as much alone as I should have been gazing at a landscape, the harmony of which I could understand. He was no more, then, than an object, the properties of which, in my musing contemplations, I sought to explore. The perpetual discovery in him of this pre-existent, this aeonial creature, this aristocrat who was just what Robert aspired not to be, gave me a keen delight, but one that was intellectual and not social. In the moral and physical agility which gave so much grace to his kindnesses, in the ease with which he offered my grandmother his carriage and made her get into it, in the alacrity with which he sprang from the box, when he was afraid that I might be cold, to spread his own cloak over my shoulders, I felt not only the inherited litheness of the mighty hunters who had been for generations the ancestors of this young man, who made no pretense save to intellectuality, their scorn of wealth, which, subsisting in him side by side with his enjoyment of it simply because it enabled him to entertain his friends more lavishly, made him so carelessly shower his riches at their feet. I felt in him especially the certainty or the illusion in the minds of those great lords of being, better than other people, thanks to which they had not been able to hand down to Saint Loup that anxiety to show that one is just as good, that dread of seeming inferior, of which he was indeed wholly unconscious, but which mars with so much ugliness, so much awkwardness, the most sincere overtures of a plebeian. Sometimes I found fault with myself for thus taking pleasure in my friend as in a work of art, that is to say, in regarding the play of all the parts of his being as harmoniously ordered by a general idea from which they depended, but which he did not know, so that it added nothing to his own good qualities, to that personal value, intellectual and moral, to which he attached so high a price. And yet that idea was to a certain extent their determining cause. It was because he was a gentleman that mental activity, those socialist aspirations, which made him seek the company of young students, arrogant and ill-dressed, connoted in him something really pure and disinterested, which was not to be found in them. Looking upon himself as the heir of an ignorant and selfish caste, he was sincerely anxious that they should forgive in him that aristocratic origin which they, on the contrary, found irresistibly attractive, and on account of which they sought to know him, though with a show of coldness and indeed of insolence towards him. He was thus led to make advances to people from whom my parents, faithful to the sociological theories of Combray, would have been stupefied at his not turning away in disgust. One day when we were sitting on the sands, Saint-Loup and I, we heard issuing from a canvas tent against which we were leaning a torrent of imprecation against the swarm of Israelites that infested Baalbec. "You can't go a yard without meeting them," said the voice. "I am not in principle irremediably hostile to the Jewish nation, but here there is a plethora of them." "Aye they, Abraham, I've just theen Jacob." "You would think you were in the Rue d'Auberquier." The man who thus inveighed against Israel emerged at last from the tent. We raised our eyes to behold this anti-Semite. It was my old friend Bloch. Saint-Loup at once begged me to remind him that they had met before the Board of Examiners, when Bloch had carried off the prize of honor, and since then at a popular university course. In the most I may have smiled now and then to discover in Robert the marks of his Jesuit schooling, and the awkwardness which the fear of hurting people's feelings at once created in him whenever one of his intellectual friends made a social error, did something silly to which Saint-Loup himself attached no importance, but felt that the other would have blushed if anybody had noticed it. And it was Robert who used to blush as though it had been he that was to blame. For instance, on the day when Bloch, after promising to come and see him at the hotel, went on, "As I cannot endure to be kept waiting among all the false splendor of these great caravanserais, and the Hungarian band would make me ill, you must tell the left boy to make them shut up, and to let you know at once." Personally, I was not particularly anxious that Bloch should come to the hotel. He was at Baalbec, not by himself, unfortunately, but with his sisters, and they in turn had innumerable relatives and friends staying there. Now this Jewish colony was more picturesque than pleasant. Baalbec was in this respect like such countries as Russia or Romania, where the geography books teach us that the Israelite population does not enjoy anything approaching the same esteem and has not reached the same stage of assimilation as, for instance, in Paris. Always together, with no blend of any other element, when the cousins and uncles of Bloch, or their co-religionists, male or female, repaired to the casino, the ladies to dance, the gentlemen branching off toward the baccarat tables, they formed a solid troop, homogeneous within itself, and utterly dissimilar to the people who watched them go past, and found them there again every year without ever exchanging a word or a sign with them, whether these were on the Camembert's list, or the presiding magistrate's little group, professional or business people, or even simple corn chandlers from Paris, whose daughters, handsome, proud, derisive, and French as the statues at Rheims, would not care to mix with that horde of ill-bred tomboys, who carried their zeal for seaside fashion so far as to be always apparently on their way home from shrimping or out to dance the tango. As for the men, despite the brilliance of their dinner jackets and patent leather shoes, the exaggeration of their type made one think of what people call the intelligent research of painters, who, having to illustrate the Gospels or the Arabian Nights, consider the country in which the scenes are laid, and give to St. Peter or to Ali Baba the identical features of the heaviest punter at the Baalbec tables. Bloch introduced his sisters, who, though he silenced their chatter with the utmost rudeness, screamed with laughter at the mildest sallies of this brother, their blindly worshipped idol. So that it is probable that this set of people contained, like every other, perhaps more than any other, plenty of attraction, merits, and virtues. But in order to experience these, one had first to penetrate its enclosure. Now it was not popular. It could feel this. It saw in its unpopularity the mark of an anti-Semitism to which it presented a bold front in a compact, enclosed phalanx, into which, as it happened, no one ever dreamed of trying to make his way. At his use of the word life, I had all the less reason to be surprised in that, a few days before, Bloch having asked me why I had come to Baalbec, although it seemed to him perfectly natural that he himself should be there, and whether it had been in the hope of making grand friends, when I had explained to him that this visit was a fulfillment of one of my earliest longings, though one not so deep as my longing to see Venice, he had replied, "Yes, of course, to sip iced drinks with the pretty ladies while you pretend to be reading The Stones of Venice, by Lord John Ruskin, a dreary shaver, in fact one of the most garrulous old barbers that you could find." So that Bloch evidently thought that in England not only were all the inhabitants of the male sex called Lord, but the letter I was invariably pronounced I. As for Saint Loup, this mistake in pronunciation seemed to him all the less serious, inasmuch as he saw in it preeminently a want of those almost society notions which my new friend despised as fully as he was versed in them. But the fear lest Bloch, discovering one day that one says Venice, and that Ruskin was not a lord, should retrospectively imagine that Robert had been laughing at him, made the latter feel as guilty as if he had been found wanting in the indulgence with which, as we have seen, he overflowed, so that the blush which would no doubt one day dye the cheek of Bloch on the discovery of his error, Robert already, by anticipation and reflex action, could feel mounting to his own. For he fully believed that Bloch attached more importance than he to this mistake. Which Bloch proved to be true some time later when he heard me pronounce the word lift by breaking in with, "Oh, you say lift, do you?" And then in a dry, lofty tone, "Not that it is of the slightest importance." A phrase that is like a reflex action of the body, the same in all men whose self-esteem is great, in the gravest circumstances as well as in the most trivial, betraying there as clearly as on this occasion how important the thing in question seems to him who declares that it is of no importance. A tragic phrase at times, the first to escape, and then how heartbreaking, the lips of every man at all proud from whom we have just taken the last hope to which he still clung by refusing to do him a service. "Oh, well, it's not of the slightest importance. I shall make some other arrangement." The other arrangement which it is not of the slightest importance that he should be driven to adopt being often suicide. Apart from this, Bloch made me the prettiest speeches. He was certainly anxious to be on the best of terms with me, and yet he asked me, "Is it because you've taken a fancy to raise yourself to the peerage that you've run after de Saint Loup and Bray? You must be going through a fine crisis of snobbery. Tell me, are you a snob?" "I think so. What?" Not that his desire to be friendly had suddenly changed, but what is called, in not too correct language, ill-breeding, was his defect, and therefore the defect which he was bound to overlook, all the more that by which he did not believe that other people could be shocked. In the human race, the frequency of the virtues that are identical in us all is not more wonderful than the multiplicity of the defects that are peculiar to each one of us. Undoubtedly, it is not common sense that is the commonest thing in the world, but human kindness. In the most distant, the most desolate ends of the earth, we marvel to see it blossom of its own accord, as in a remote valley a poppy like the poppies in the world beyond, poppies which it has never seen as it has never known aught but the wind, that now and again, stirring the folds of its scarlet cloak, disturbs its solitude. Even if this human kindness, paralyzed by self-interest, is not exercised, it exists none the less, and whenever any inconstant egoist does not restrain its action, when, for example, he is reading a novel or a newspaper, It will bud, blossom, grow, even in the heart of him who, cold-blooded in real life, has retained a tender heart as a lover of fiction for the weak, the righteous, and the persecuted. But the variety of our defects is no less remarkable than the similarity of our virtues. Each of us has his own, so much so that to continue loving him we are obliged not to take them into account, but to ignore them and look only to the rest of his character. The most perfect person in the world has a certain defect which shocks us or makes us angry. One man is of rare intelligence, sees everything from an exalted angle, never speaks evil of anyone, but will pocket and forget letters of supreme importance which it was he himself who asked you to let him post for you, and will then miss a vital engagement without offering you any excuse, with a smile, because he prides himself upon never knowing the time. Another is so refined, so gentle, so delicate in his conduct, that he never says anything about you before your face except what you are glad to hear. But you feel that he refrains from uttering, that he keeps buried in his heart, where they grow bitter, very different opinions, and the pleasure that he derives from seeing you is so dear to him that he will let you faint with exhaustion sooner than leave you to yourself. A third has more sincerity, but carries it so far that he feels bound to let you know, when you have pleaded the state of your health as an excuse for not having been to see him, that you were seen going to the theatre and were reported to be looking well, or else that he has not been able to profit entirely by the action which you have taken on his behalf, which, by the way, 3 other of his friends had already offered to take, so that he is only moderately indebted to you. In similar circumstances, the previous friend would have pretended not to know that you had gone to the theatre, or that other people could have done him the same service. But this last friend feels himself obliged to repeat or to reveal to somebody the very thing that is most likely to give offense, is delighted with his own frankness, and tells you emphatically, "I am like that," while others infuriate you by their exaggerated curiosity, or by a want of curiosity so absolute that you can speak to them of the most sensational happenings without their grasping what it is all about. And others again take months to answer you if your letter has been about something that concerns yourself and not them. Or else, if they write that they are coming to ask you for something, and you dare not leave the house for fear of missing them, do not appear, but leave you in suspense for weeks, because, not having received from you the answer which their letter did not in the least expect, they have concluded that you must be cross with them. And others, considering their own wishes and not yours, talk to you without letting you get a word in if they are in good spirits and want to see you, however urgent the work you may have in hand. But if they feel exhausted by the weather or out of humor, you cannot get a word out of them. They meet your efforts with an inert languor, and no more take the trouble to reply, even in monosyllables, to what you say to them than if they had not heard you. Each of our friends has his defects so markedly that to continue to love him we are obliged to seek consolation for those defects, in the thought of his talent, his goodness, his affection for ourself, or rather to leave them out of account, and for that we need to display all our goodwill. Unfortunately, our obliging obstinacy in refusing to see the defect in our friend is surpassed by the obstinacy with which he persists in that defect, from his own blindness to it, or the blindness that he attributes to other people. For he does not notice it himself, or imagines that it is not noticed. Since the risk of giving offense arises principally from the difficulty of appreciating what does and what does not pass unperceived, we ought, at least from prudence, never to speak of ourselves, because that is a subject on which we may be sure that other people's views are never in accordance with our own. If we find as many surprises as on visiting a house of plain exterior, which inside is full of hidden treasures, torture chambers, skeletons, when we discover the true lives of other people, the real beneath the apparent universe, we are no less surprised if, in place of the image that we have made of ourself with the help of all the things that people have said to us, we learn from the terms in which they speak of us in our absence what an entirely different image they have been carrying in their own minds of us and of our life. So that whenever we have spoken about ourselves, we may be sure that our inoffensive and prudent words, listened to with apparent politeness and hypocritical approbation, have given rise afterwards to the most exasperated or the most mirthful, but in either case the least favorable criticism. The least risk that we run is that of irritating people by the disproportion that there is between our idea of ourself and the words that we use, a disproportion which, as a rule, makes people's talk about themselves as ludicrous as the performances of those self-styled music lovers, who, when they feel the need to hum a favorite melody, compensate for the inadequacy of their inarticulate murmurings by a strenuous mimicry, and a look of admiration which is hardly justified by all that they let us hear. And to the bad habit of speaking about oneself and one's defects there must be added, as part of the same thing, that habit of denouncing in other people defects precisely analogous to one's own. For it is always of those defects that people speak, as though it were a way of speaking about oneself indirectly, which added to the pleasure of absolution that of confession. Besides, it seems that our attention, always attracted by what is characteristic of ourself, notices that more than anything else in other people. One short-sighted man says of another, but he can scarcely open his eyes. A consumptive has his doubts as to the pulmonary integrity of the most robust. An unwashed man speaks only of the baths that other people do not take. An evil-smelling man insists that other people smell. A cuckold sees cuckolds everywhere. A light woman, light women. A snob, snobs. Then, too, every vice, like every profession, requires and trains a special knowledge which we are never loath to display. The invert detects and denounces inverts. The tailor, asked out to dine, before he has begun to talk to you, has passed judgment on the cloth of your coat, which his fingers are itching to feel. And if after a few words of conversation you were to ask a dentist what he really thought of you, he would tell you how many of your teeth wanted filling. To him nothing appears more important, nor more absurd to you who have noticed his own. And it is not only when we speak of ourselves that we imagine other people to be blind. We behave as though they were. On every one of us there is a special God in attendance who hides from him or promises him the concealment from other people of his defect, just as he stops the eyes and nostrils of people who do not wash to the streaks of dirt which they carry in their ears, and the smell of sweat which emanates from their armpits, and assures them that they can with impunity carry both of these about a world that will notice nothing. And those who wear artificial pearls, or give them as presents, imagine that people will take them to be genuine. Bloch was ill-bred, neurotic, a snob, and since he belonged to a family of little repute, had to support, as on the floor of ocean, the incalculable pressure that was imposed on him not only by the Christians upon the surface, but by all the intervening layers of Jewish castes superior to his own, each of them crushing with its contempt the one that was immediately beneath it. To carve his way through to the open air by raising himself from Jewish family to Jewish family would have taken Bloch many thousands of years. It was better worth his while to seek an outlet in another direction. End of section 29.